Come in and settle. Pull the blanket up if you have one nearby, dim whatever light is still on, and let your shoulders drop for a moment before we begin. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over, the way you might turn over a stone you found on a walk, curious about what it is really made of. Tonight I want to tell it to you slowly the way it deserves, while the rest of the world goes quiet around you. Here is what I want you to know before anything else. For almost the entire span of human history, sitting down to a meal was not the safe, ordinary act it is for you tonight. It was more often than anyone likes to admit a quiet gamble. Bread could be a lie. Milk could be a trick. A sweet, colourful treat handed to a child on a market afternoon could in certain terrible moments be the last thing that child ever tasted. Nobody in these old streets and old kitchens meant for it to be this way, and that is part of what makes it so strange to think about now, lying warm and unhurried where you are. The danger was not always cruelty, sometimes it was carelessness. Sometimes it was simple human ignorance stacked up over generations waiting for the wrong afternoon to arrive. Let me take you to one particular afternoon. Picture a market town in the north of England in the middle of the 1800s when the streets still smell of coal smoke and damp stone, and the light in late afternoon turns the colour of weak tea. There is a square filled with stalls, wooden carts, the low constant murmur of buying and selling that has not changed all that much in 1,000 years. Among the stalls stands a man everyone in the neighbourhood knows by nickname rather than surname, the way certain tradesmen become fixtures of a place. He keeps a simple wooden tray balanced against his hip and on it arranged with the small pride of someone who has done this work for years, sight rows of pale round sweets, the kind children save their pennies for all week. He calls out to passers-by the way he always has, and children run toward him the way children always do toward something sweet and familiar. A woman stops with her daughter, presses a coin into his palm, and receives back a small paper twist of candy still faintly warm from where it sat near the afternoon sun. It is such an ordinary transaction that nobody pauses to think about it twice. It has happened 1,000 times before on 1,000 other afternoons in 1,000 other towns just like this one, and that is exactly what makes it so unsettling to sit with now. Because in this particular batch of sweets, on this particular afternoon, something has gone quietly and visibly wrong. Not through any wickedness, not through any plan. Somewhere earlier that week in a workshop a few streets away, an ordinary ingredient was measured out by a man doing his ordinary job, and the measurement he trusted was not what he believed it to be. Nothing about the sweets looks different. Nothing about their taste at first gives any warning. The woman walks away with her daughter, the candy already disappearing into small happy mouths, and for a moment everything in this square is exactly as peaceful as it appears. I am not going to rush you toward what happens next. We have hours together tonight, and this story deserves to be told at the pace it actually unfolded, not the pace of alarm. But I want you to sit for a moment with that feeling, the strange vertigo of it. A sweet, ordinary thing trusted without a second thought, carrying inside it a danger nobody could see or taste or smell. That is the quiet, aching truth at the centre of tonight's story. For most of human history, knowing what was safe to eat was not knowledge you were simply handed. It was knowledge paid for again and again in ways that were rarely fair and rarely gentle. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how anyone ever learned which mushrooms in a forest would nourish you and which would kill you within hours? It makes you wonder how many centuries passed, how many quiet tragedies in small villages before entire cultures agreed almost instinctively that certain berries were forbidden and certain waters were cursed. Certain meats had to be cooked a particular way or not eaten at all. Somewhere behind every food rule that feels obvious to us now, there is very likely a person or a family or an entire village who learned it the hardest way possible. And it makes you wonder something else too. something we will return to later tonight. How does an entire society finally decide after generations of trusting blindly that trust alone is no longer enough? What does it take for people to demand proof of what is safe instead of simply hoping? Before we go further into that world, I want to ask something small of you, if you do not mind. If this is the kind of history you find yourself drawn to, the quiet, human, unhurried kind, it helps enormously if you take a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like before you drift off tonight. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think to someone piecing these stories together. And if you have a moment before sleep pulls you under, I would love to know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight and what it was about this particular story that made you want to press play. I read every one, even the ones left at strange hours of the night, because in a strange way they remind me that this quiet ritual we are doing together right now is shared by more people than either of us could easily picture. Now let yourself settle in fully. There is no need to hold on to anything, just listen. Because to really understand that afternoon in that northern town and everything that led up to it, we have to step back much further than one market square and one tray of sweets. We have to go back to the very beginning of the relationship between human beings and the food in front of them. Long before shops, long before towns, long before anyone thought to write down a single rule about what was safe. We have to go back to a world where every meal was still in the truest sense, an experiment, and where the line between nourishment and danger had not yet been drawn by anyone at all. For nearly the whole of human existence there was no such thing as a label, no list of ingredients, no small print warning of what a substance might do to the body, no authority anywhere whose entire purpose was to stand between a person and their food and say quietly, "This is safe," or "This is not." There was only the world itself offered up in silence, and the long, patient, often costly process of learning to read it. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Somewhere in a river valley or a forest clearing, thousands of years before anything we would recognize as history, a person picks up a plant they have never eaten before. It looks like something else they know to be edible. It smells perhaps faintly sweet. There is no chemist to consult, no elder who has already tested it, because someone somewhere always has to be first. That person eats it and either walks away having learned something small and useful, or does not walk away at all. Multiply that single moment by thousands of years, by every continent, by every new plant and root and berry and mushroom that early humans encountered as they moved into unfamiliar land, and you begin to understand the sheer scale of what it costs to arrive at something as simple as a list of foods a person could trust. It helps to sit with the mushroom for a moment, because few foods in nature illustrate the stakes quite so plainly. Certain mushrooms found across the forests of Europe and Asia contain compounds that give almost no warning at all. A person can eat one, feel perfectly well for hours, even a full day, and go about their life with no sense that anything is wrong, only for the poison to begin quietly dismantling the liver from the inside, by which point it is often too late to reverse. There is something almost cruel about the design of it. A kind of biological trick that offers no immediate signal, no bitter taste, no instant regret, only a delayed and devastating consequence. It is easy to imagine how many early communities must have lost someone this way without ever fully understanding why, attributing the death to a curse or an evil spirit or the displeasure of some unseen force, because the true cause, a molecule too small to see and too slow to suspect, was entirely beyond their reach. Only much later, with the tools of modern chemistry, would anyone actually understand what these mushrooms were doing to the human body, and even now, scholars studying the history of foraging cultures acknowledge that the full record of exactly how often this knowledge was learned and passed down remains frustratingly incomplete. What survives is mostly the outcome, the deep, universal caution around wild mushrooms found in cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, a caution that had to be earned the hardest way there is. And it was not only about outright poison. Sometimes the danger was slower and stranger, woven into food that seemed on its surface entirely wholesome. In parts of medieval Europe, communities occasionally experienced outbreaks of a mysterious affliction that caused burning sensations in the limbs, hallucinations, and in severe cases the blackening and loss of fingers and toes. For centuries nobody could explain it. People described a sensation of their skin being consumed by invisible flame, which is part of why the condition eventually became known in some regions by a name invoking fire and holy suffering. It would be a very long time before anyone connected these terrifying episodes to something as mundane as the grain used to bake bread. Rye, when stored in damp conditions, can become host to a small, dark fungus that produces compounds capable of constricting blood vessels and altering the mind of anyone who eats bread made from the contaminated flour. Entire villages could be affected at once because entire villages were quite naturally eating from the same harvester, the same mill, the same loaves passed from oven to table. Historians who study these outbreaks today generally agree that certain waves of unexplained mass affliction in medieval communities line up closely with periods of wet weather that would have favoured this fungus growing on stored rye, though the historical record from village to village is patchy enough that no single explanation accounts for every documented case. What is certain is this: for the people living through it, there was no way to trace cause and effect. Bread was bread. It came from the same fields their families had trusted for generations. The idea that safety could be quietly stolen from something so familiar would have felt almost unthinkable. This is, I think, the detail worth sitting with tonight, the one that tends to surprise people the most when they first hear it. It was not usually the unfamiliar food that proved most dangerous. It was the familiar one, the trusted one, the food that had always seemed safe until, for reasons no one could see, it quietly wasn't. Danger did not announce itself as something foreign or strange. It hid inside the ordinary. It arrived disguised as bread, as grain, as the very things people depended on to survive at all. There is a particular kind of vulnerability in that one that goes beyond simple ignorance of biology, when your entire understanding of what is safe rests on repetition on the fact that a food has never hurt you before. You're placing enormous trust in a pattern holding steady. And patterns, as it turns out, do not always hold. A harvest stored under slightly different conditions. A mushroom picked a season later than usual in slightly different soil. A batch of grain drawn from a part of the field that flooded more than the rest. Small shifts invisible to anyone without modern tools could turn something trusted into something lethal, and no one standing in that moment would have had any way of knowing until it was already too late. Slowly across generations, across cultures that had almost no contact with one another, human beings began building a kind of inherited caution, a body of unwritten rules passed from parent to child, from elder to community, about which foods needed careful handling, which needed to be avoided entirely in certain seasons, which needed a particular preparation before they were considered fit to eat. None of it came from a textbook. All of it came from loss. Every rule that seems to us now almost too obvious to mention, whether it is soaking a certain root before cooking it or avoiding shellfish gathered during particular months, or refusing to eat a fish with a strange colour. Beneath its scales very likely traces back to someone who did not survive learning it. It is a strange kind of inheritance, this quiet library of caution built entirely out of grief, carried forward not in writing but in habit. In the almost instinctive way a grandmother might refuse a certain food without being fully able to explain why, only that it had always been considered unwise. What makes this part of the story feel especially close lying where you are tonight is how invisible this inheritance has become. You likely do not think when you reach for a meal about the thousands of years of trial, error, and loss that shaped which foods are simply understood without question to be safe. That understanding feels like a given almost weightless, when in fact it took an almost unimaginable accumulation of small human tragedies to build. And this quiet, ancient relationship between people and their food built on instinct and inherited caution would eventually collide with something entirely new, something that did not come from nature at all, but from human hands, human choices, and a kind of danger that no amount of old inherited wisdom had ever prepared anyone to recognize. History carries a strange kind of memory, one that does not live in books or monuments but inhabit in the small unquestioned rules a family follows without ever explaining why. And nowhere is that memory more vivid or more hard-won than in the story of how humans learned piece by piece, generation by generation, to tell a nourishing meal from a fatal one. Watch for a moment the oldest teacher any of these communities ever had, not a person at all but the animals living alongside them. Long before anyone kept written records of what was safe to gather, people paid close attention to which berries the birds avoided, which leaves the deer left untouched even in the hungriest part of winter, which roots the pigs dug for eagerly, and which ones they seemed instinctively to reject. This was not superstition. It was observation, patient and practical, built up across seasons and passed down as something closer to folklore than science, though it functioned in its own quiet way as an early and remarkably effective form of testing. A plant that every grazing animal in a valley refused to touch became over time a plant that the people of that valley refused to touch as well. Nobody needed to understand the chemistry behind the avoidance. They only needed to notice the pattern and trust it. Trust, though, could only carry a community so far because animals and humans do not always share the same vulnerabilities. Some plants that are perfectly harmless to a deer or a bird can be quietly devastating to a person, and there was no way in those early centuries for anyone to know in advance which category a new plant might fall into. This is part of what made certain regions of the world so treacherous for early foragers, and part of what makes the story of one particular fish so striking even now. Along the coasts of what is today Japan, communities have for centuries prepared a fish whose flesh is prized as a delicacy, but whose organs contain one of the most potent natural poisons known to exist, a toxin, so precise in its effect that even now, with all the tools of modern medicine, there remains no reliable antidote once a lethal dose has been consumed. It attacks the nervous system with quiet, methodical cruelty, leaving a person fully conscious, while the body slowly loses the ability to move right up until the muscles controlling breath itself give out. And yet across generations, cooks in these coastal communities learned through what can only have been an agonizing accumulation of trial and loss, precisely which parts of the fish had to be removed and how before the rest could be safely eaten. This knowledge eventually became so specialized that in later centuries it required years of formal apprenticeship to master an acknowledgement written directly into law of just how easily this particular skill could go fatally wrong in untrained hands. Historians studying the origins of this practice generally agree. It developed over an extremely long period of informal trial, though the full record of exactly how many generations it took and how many lives were lost along the way before the technique was reliably passed down is something no horn-sewing document can fully answer. There is something worth pausing on here, something almost tender beneath the danger. This was not carelessness. This was devotion, a community's refusal to simply give up on a food it valued choosing, instead to study the danger so closely over so many years that it eventually turned near certain death into something that could be prepared with confidence so long as the knowledge was honored and never rushed. Not every solution came from studying a single dangerous food so intently. Sometimes the answer came from an entirely different direction, from techniques that transformed food itself into something safer than it had been in its raw state. Salt is perhaps the oldest and most quietly remarkable example. Long before anyone understood the microscopic world of bacteria, people across wildly different regions from the coasts of the Mediterranean to the interior of ancient China independently discovered that packing meat or fish in salt allowed it to survive far longer than it otherwise would without becoming something that made the eater ill. They did not know they were drawing water out of the environment that harmful microorganisms needed to thrive. They only knew that salted meat kept and unsalted meat did not, and that difference alone was reason enough to build an entire tradition, an entire economy in some regions around the substance. Fermentation offers an even stranger example because on its surface it seems to defy the very caution people had learned to apply to spoiled or strange-smelling food. A cabbage left to sit in brine for weeks, a milk allowed to sour and thicken into something new, a soybean paste left to age in a dark room until its smell grows sharp and pungent. All of these should by instinct seem like exactly the kind of food early caution would reject. And yet across nearly every continent, entirely separate cultures arrived at fermentation as a deliberate practice, discovering again through nothing but patient repetition that certain kinds of controlled decay made food not only safe but in some cases considerably healthier than it had been before, protecting against illnesses that would otherwise have been common in communities without access to fresh food year-round. It is one of history's quieter ironies that some of the sharpest, strangest-smelling foods humans learned to eat were not dangers to be avoided at all, but rather clever, unconscious solutions to danger hiding in plain sight inside a smell that instinct alone would have told most people to avoid. Alongside these practical techniques, something else was quietly forming as well, something less easily explained by observation or trial and error, and closer to belief. Many ancient cultures developed food restrictions that carried religious or spiritual weight, prohibitions that framed certain foods not simply as unwise but as forbidden entirely. Some historians have proposed that a portion of these ancient dietary laws may have originated from practical concerns, certain meats spoiling more readily in hot climates, for example, later, becoming woven into religious and cultural identity over time. It is a compelling idea, and one that appears in a great deal of popular writing on the subject, but it is worth being honest here. Scholars who study the origins of ancient dietary law remain genuinely divided on how much of this connection reflects real historical cause, and how much is a modern attempt to find a tidy explanation for something that was more likely shaped by a much more complicated tangle of belief, identity, and practical experience all woven together in proportions. No single piece of surviving evidence can fully untangle. What can be said with more confidence is simply this. Once a practice, however it began, became bound up with a community's religious or cultural identity, it no longer needed a nutritional justification to endure. It carried forward on its own weight generation after generation, long after anyone remembered exactly why it had started. By the time you gather all of this together, the animal observation, the fish prepared with generations of hard-won precision, the salt, the ferment, the inherited taboos wrapped in belief, a picture begins to form of just how much invisible labor sits behind something as simple as a family sitting down to a meal without fear. None of it was written in a single book, none of it came from a single authority. It was built the way a coastline is built, slowly, by countless small deposits laid down over an almost unimaginable span of time, each one representing a lesson that someone somewhere paid for. And for a very long time, this was largely how the relationship between people and their food remained imperfect, hard-earned, but rooted in something at least honest. The dangers came from nature itself, from what grew wild in forests and swam in coastal waters, from what a season of unusual rain might do to a stored harvest. It was a difficult world, but in its own way an understandable one. The threat when it came from the land, not from the hands preparing the food. That quietly was about to change. As people began gathering into larger settlements, as villages grew into towns, and towns grew into the first true cities, food stopped being something grown and eaten within sight of the same small community. It began to travel, passing through more hands, more markets, more strangers before it ever reached a table. And with that distance, something new started to enter the old equation, something the accumulated wisdom of centuries had never quite prepared anyone to recognize. Seas have always made promises they could not entirely keep, and one of the oldest of those promises was food itself. The very idea of a city depends on it, thousands of people living close together, none of them growing their own grain, none of them raising their own cattle. All of them trusting that somewhere beyond the walls or beyond the edges of the map, they knew enough food would be produced and carried in to keep them alive through the year. It is an extraordinary act of collective faith when you think about it plainly, and it is also quietly where an entirely new kind of danger began to take root. In the old world of small villages, a family generally knew where its food came from because they had likely grown it or raised it or gathered it themselves, or received it from a neighbour whose fields they could see from their own doorway. That closeness was itself a kind of protection. If a baker used bad flour, everyone in the village would know it was his flour, and his reputation built over years among people he saw every single day was often enough to keep him honest. But as settlements grew larger, as roads improved and rivers filled with barges and carts, food began travelling further than ever before, passing through the hands of people who would never meet the families eating what they sold. Grain grown in one province might feed a city many days away. Fish caught on a distant coast might reach a market table long after the fisherman who caught it had already forgotten the exact day he sold it. And somewhere along that lengthening chain, a strange and quiet shift began to happen. The person selling the food no longer needed to answer to the person eating it, because in a growing city they would very likely never see each other again. It is worth sitting with how old this problem actually is, because it did not begin with the smoky factory towns most people picture when they imagine unsafe food. It reaches back much further than that. In the markets of ancient Rome, a city that at its height held close to 1 million people, officials known as aedles were tasked with overseeing the quality of goods sold in public markets, including bread and wine, precisely because complaints about short-changed weight and diluted, adulterated products were common enough to require formal oversight. Wine sellers were known on occasion to stretch their supply by adding water or worse, by using additives to mask the taste of wine that had already begun to spoil. Bakers in a city that depended enormously on its bread supply for basic social stability faced real legal consequences for selling loaves that fell short of expected weight or quality, because a city of that size understood something that smaller communities rarely had to consider so seriously, that hunger and deception layered together could become a kind of political danger all on their own. What strikes me most about this is not that ancient Rome had food fraud. It is how familiar the shape of the problem feels even across nearly 2,000 years. Evidence that the temptation to quietly cut corners when no one is watching closely enough is not a modern failing at all, but something closer to a constant wherever enough people gather and enough distance opens up between the hands that make food and the mouths that eat it. There is another detail from this era that tends to surprise people when they hear it for the first time, something that touches an entire civilization rather than a single marketplace. Historians studying ancient Rome have long pointed to the widespread use of a particular substance in daily Roman life, one that we now understand to be dangerously toxic, even in relatively small amounts absorbed slowly over years, rather than causing any sudden obvious harm. Lead was used extensively throughout the city in the pipes that carried its famous water supply, and more troublingly for our purposes tonight, in cooking. Wealthier Roman households in particular favoured a sweetener made by boiling down grape juice in lead-lined pots, a process that concentrated lead into the syrup itself, a syrup used generously to flavor wine and preserve fruit. Scholars continue to debate just how significant a role this chronic, low-level lead exposure played in the broader decline of the Roman elite, and it would be far too simple to say that lead alone explains the fall of an empire, a claim that stretches the evidence well beyond what it can responsibly support. But it remains a genuinely unsettling thought, doesn't it, that some of the very people with the most wealth, the most access to what their society considered the finest food and drink, may have been quietly poisoning themselves for generations through the very luxury meant to set them apart, entirely unaware that the sweetness they prized so highly was slowly working against them. This is in many ways the deeper truth beginning to take shape across this whole story tonight. Danger in food was no longer only a matter of nature's own unpredictability. The wild mushroom, the contaminated grain, the fish that had to be prepared, just to a new category of danger had begun to emerge alongside it. One created not by the natural world, but by human choices, human shortcuts, human blind spots, sometimes made in ignorance, and sometimes made in the full, quiet knowledge that a buyer would likely never trace a bad batch back to its source. As cities grew larger across the medieval and early modern world, from the crowded quarters of London to the busy ports of continental Europe, this second category of danger only grew alongside them, spreading wherever trust between seller and buyer stretched thin enough to break without anyone immediately noticing. Bread again and again across these centuries tells much of this story on its own, because bread was rarely just a food. In many of these growing cities, it was the food, the single item most households depended on above all else, day after day, and that dependence made it an unusually tempting target for anyone looking to quietly stretch their supply and their profit. Records from various medieval European towns describe bakers occasionally caught adding chalk or ground bone, or other cheap fillers into their flour to bulk out a loaf without using more of the genuinely expensive grain. The punishments in some places were severe precisely because the offence was taken so seriously, a reflection of how central and how vulnerable this one food had become to entire population, who had no meaningful alternative if their trusted baker turned out to be cheating them. What makes all of this feel so quietly different from everything we have talked about so far tonight is the nature of who is responsible. A poisonous mushroom has no intention. Contaminated grain host to an invisible fungus has no motive. But a baker weighing out chalk instead of flour, a wine seller adding water to a jug he knows is already thin. These are choices made by people who understood, at least in some dim way, that what they were doing carried risk for someone else, even if they rarely allowed themselves to think too closely about who that someone else might be. It's not that these people were uniquely cruel. Most of them were almost certainly ordinary under pressure, trying to make a living in difficult economic circumstances, telling themselves it was a small deception, a minor stretch, nothing that would truly hurt anyone. That is in many ways exactly how this kind of danger tends to grow, not through dramatic villainy, but through countless small human compromise, each one seeming survivable on its own. And as cities kept growing, as trade routes lengthened and populations swelled far beyond anything the old village world could have imagined, this quiet human category of danger did not fade away. It grew more organized, more embedded in the very systems people relied on for their daily meals, waiting for the particular set of conditions, a little more distance, a little more anonymity, a little more profit at stake that would eventually let it slip almost entirely out of anyone's sight. By the time the world reaches the great cities of the industrial age, something has shifted so slowly that almost no one alive to see it fully understands how far it has drifted from where it began. The old dangers, the wild mushroom, the tainted grain have never entirely disappeared, but they have been joined now by something quieter and in its own way more unsettling. a danger built not by nature, and not even by the isolated dishonesty of a single baker cutting corners in a small medieval town, but by something closer to a system, a whole way of doing business that has learned almost without anyone deciding it outright that deception can be profitable so long as it stays hidden. Picture London in the early decades of the 1800s, a city swelling faster than any city in human history had ever swelled before, its population climbing past 1 million and then well beyond it within a single lifetime. Feeding a city of that size had become an enterprise of staggering scale, a vast, tangled web of markets, merchants, and middlemen, through which food travelled from field to table, often changing hands many times along the way. And somewhere inside that tangle a quiet, almost invisible practice had taken root, one that touched nearly everything a family in this city might set on its dinner table. Tea offers one of the clearest windows into how deeply this practice had settled in. Tea by this point had become something close to a national ritual across England, consumed by rich and poor alike, and the demand for it was enormous. Genuine tea leaves imported from great distances carried real cost, and somewhere along the supply chain, certain merchants discovered they could stretch their tea and their profit by mixing in used leaves already brewed once and dried again, or by adding entirely different leaves altogether, sometimes gathered from hedgerows and treated with substances to mimic the colour of real tea. In some cases, the colouring agents used to make these fillers look convincingly green or black were themselves toxic, containing compounds that consumed steadily over months and years could cause real and lasting harm. A family pouring their evening tea, believing they were doing something as safe and familiar as anything in their day, had no way of knowing whether the leaves in their pot were entirely what they appeared to be. Milk tells a similarly uncomfortable story, and it is worth pausing on this one because milk carried a particular kind of trust attached to it, given so often to children, specifically because it was believed to nourish and strengthen them. In a rapidly growing city, keeping cows became increasingly difficult, and much of London's milk supply came from dairies pressed for space and struggling to keep their animals healthy in crowded, poorly ventilated conditions, to stretch a limited and increasingly costly supply. Further, some sellers added water to their milk, sometimes drawn from sources that were themselves far from clean, and to disguise the resulting thin, pale colour, certain additives were mixed in, including substances such as chalk, and in some documented cases compounds containing traces of substances we would now immediately recognise as dangerous. Isn't it a strange, almost aching thought that a mother in this era, doing everything she believed was right for her child by offering a cup of milk each morning, might unknowingly be handing over something quietly compromised, diluted not by nature, but by another person's decision made far away for reasons that had nothing to do with her family at all? Bread, as it so often does across this history, carries its own chapter in this particular decade as well, though. By now the adulteration had grown more sophisticated than the chalk and bone fillers of earlier centuries. Alum, a mineral compound, became a common addition to bread flour during this period, prized by bakers because it allowed cheaper, lower quality, sometimes slightly spoiled flour to still produce a loaf that looked bright white and appealingly fresh. Exactly the kind of bread that customers trained by habit to associate whiteness with purity and quality would reach for first. The health effects of consuming alum regularly, particularly for children, were not fully understood at the time, though later investigation would raise real concerns about its impact on digestion. What makes this detail and with particular weight is the layer of psychology folded into it. Customers were not simply being deceived about quantity, as with the earlier chalk-laden loaves. They were being deceived through their own trust in appearance itself, taught in a sense to prefer the very loaves most likely to have been altered, because the alteration had been specifically designed to satisfy an expectation people did not even know they had been given. There is something worth understanding about why this particular era saw adulteration flourish so widely, and it has less to do with any sudden collapse in honesty among merchants and far more to do with the conditions the growing city itself had created. In earlier village life, a seller who cheated a customer risked being recognized, gossiped about, avoided at the very same market the following week. But in a city with 1 million residents, in a market serving customers who might never return to the same stall twice, that old social consequence had simply dissolved. A merchant could sell adulterated tea to a stranger on a Tuesday and never see that person again, never face the quiet community-based accountability that had once kept smaller markets relatively honest. Some historians studying this period have argued that this loss of face-to-face accountability, more than simple greed, explains why adulteration became so widespread specifically in large, fast-growing cities during this era. Though the full picture likely involves a tangle of economic pressure, weak regulation and opportunity, all reinforcing one another, and the surviving evidence does not allow anyone to weigh these factors with complete precision. What deserves particular attention here gently is how little malice most of this actually required. It is tempting, looking back from where you are now, to imagine rooms full of merchants rubbing their hands together, delighting in the harm they caused. But the far more likely truth, the one that historians of this period tend to find more consistently supported by surviving records, is something quieter, and in its way sadder. Most of these adulterations began as small, almost reasonable-seeming decisions made by people under real economic pressure, competing against neighbours who had already begun cutting the same corners, each one telling themselves that a little water in the milk, a little chalk in the bread was a survivable compromise, not real harm, certainly nothing compared to what someone else down the street was already doing. Danger once again slipped in, not through cruelty, but through the slow, cumulative weight of many small human justifications, each one seeming on its own almost forgivable. And yet even as this practice spread quietly through market stalls and grocers' shelves across the growing city, there were here and there a handful of people beginning to notice, not officials, not lawmakers, not anyone with the power to change very much at all, at least not yet. Just a few careful, curious observers, the kind of people who like to look closely at things everyone else had simply learned to take for granted, starting to ask an uncomfortable question about the food quietly filling the pantries of an entire city, a question that would not remain unanswered for very much longer. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to the person who sees a problem before anyone else is ready to see it. And few figures in this story embody that loneliness quite so clearly as a German-born chemist living in London in the early decades of the 1800s, a man whose name has mostly faded from popular memory, though what he did deserves to be remembered far more than it is. His name was Frederick Ackham, and by the time he turned his full attention to the question of what London's food actually contained, he had already built a respected career studying chemistry, teaching it, writing about it, moving in scientific circles that took his work seriously. He was not an outsider shouting from the margins. He was by most measures exactly the kind of credible established figure whose warning should have carried weight. And in 1820, he published a book that laid out in careful methodical detail precisely what he had found when he applied real chemical analysis to the food quietly sitting on London's shelves and in London's pantries. The title alone tells you something about the tone. He chose a title drawn from an old biblical phrase warning that there was, in his words, death in the pot. It was not hyperbole dressed up for effect. It was closer to restraint given what the book actually documented. Ackham described with the precision of a working scientist rather than a sensationalist the presence of toxic compounds in everyday goods that families across the city consumed without a second thought. He detailed how certain sweets brightly coloured to catch a child's eye were tinted, using compounds containing substances now understood to be genuinely poisonous absorbed gradually into the body with each small sweet taste. He described the practices around bread, tea and beer that we have already spent time with tonight, but he did something those earlier scattered observations had not quite managed to do. He gathered it all together, tested it, documented it and put a name to it. And in doing so, he turned a collection of half-suspected rumours into something closer to established fact. It is worth pausing to consider what a genuinely radical act this was for its time. Accum was not simply describing a moral failing among a few dishonest merchants. He was suggesting with real evidence behind him that an entire economic system, one that a growing city had come to depend on completely, had quietly organised itself around practices that were slowly harming the very people it claimed to feed. That is an uncomfortable thing to say about any society in any era, and it remains uncomfortable now. There is a reason whistleblowers of every kind across every century tend to find their warnings met first with silence, then with resistance, and only much later, if ever, with real change. Accum's warning followed almost exactly that pattern. His book did attract attention, and for a brief period it seemed as though it might genuinely shift public awareness. Newspapers discussed it. Educated readers who could afford his book and who had the leisure to read something as dense as a chemical treatise took an interest. But attention, as it turns out, is not the same thing as change, and here the story grows quietly sadder rather than dramatically worse. The very merchants and tradesmen whose practices Accum had exposed had every reason to push back and push back. They did not always through open argument, but through something closer to erosion, a slow campaign of doubt and discomfort aimed at the man himself rather than the facts he had presented. Within a few years of publishing his findings, Accum found himself facing accusations in an entirely different matter. Accused of damaging books belonging to a scientific institution, he was associated with a controversy that historians studying his life still regard with some genuine uncertainty about exactly how much of the accusation reflected real wrongdoing and how much reflected the convenient timing of powerful interests eager to see his credibility undermined. Whatever the full truth of that particular episode, and the surviving evidence does not allow anyone to state it with complete confidence, either way, the practical effect was the same. A man who had built years of scientific credibility found that credibility publicly questioned at almost exactly the moment his warnings about food had begun to gain real traction. He eventually left London for the German states, his reputation in England considerably diminished, and with his departure, much of the momentum his warnings had generated quietly faded as well. Isn't there something familiar in that pattern, even now centuries later? The person who first names an uncomfortable truth rarely gets to enjoy watching that truth immediately corrected. More often they absorb the discomfort of having spoken first, while the actual problem continues on largely undisturbed for a good while longer. And continue it did. In the decades following Accum's book Adulteration in London, and across many of England's growing cities, did not simply fade away under the weight of his evidence. If anything, in certain corners of the trade it grew more entrenched, protected now by a kind of quiet, unspoken agreement among those who benefited from it. An agreement not to look too closely, not to ask too many uncomfortable questions, not to disturb a system that had, after all, been feeding the city for years without any obvious catastrophe forcing the issue. Part of what allowed this to continue for as long as it did was the simple practical difficulty of detection. Chemistry in this era, remarkable as Accum's own work had been, was still a specialized skill requiring equipment and training that most ordinary buyers and even most local officials simply did not have access to. A shopkeeper could look at a loaf of bread or a twist of tea or a jug of milk and see nothing at all out of the ordinary. Because the alterations had by this point become sophisticated enough that they were genuinely invisible to the naked eye and the untrained palate. Detection required someone willing to bring real scientific method into an everyday marketplace, and for a very long stretch of these middle decades, very few people had the resources, the standing, or frankly, the appetite after watching what had happened to Ackham to take up that particular fight again quite so publicly. There is a quieter, more human layer worth sitting with here as well, something beyond the specific mechanics of chemistry and commerce. For an ordinary family living through these decades, the growing, if still largely unspoken, suspicion that their food might not be entirely what it claimed to be must have created a particular kind of low, persistent unease, one that never rose to the level of open panic because life still had to continue. Meals still had to be prepared and eaten every single day regardless. What choice did most people actually have? They could not test their own bread for chalk. They could not analyze their own tea leaves for coloring agents. They were in the most literal sense dependent on trusting sellers. Many of them had begun to quietly, privately doubt a trust extended not because it felt entirely safe, but because there was in practice no real alternative available to most working families trying to feed themselves and their children within the means they had. This is, I think, one of the more haunting aspects of this whole period, one that tends to get lost when this history is told in a rush. It was not that people were simply ignorant of the danger the way earlier generations had been genuinely unaware of what caused certain mushrooms to kill or certain grains to poison an entire village. By the middle of the 1800s, a meaningful portion of London's population had at least some vague awareness that adulteration was a real and ongoing problem. Thanks in no small part to Ackham's earlier work and the scattered discussions it had sparked. And yet awareness alone changed remarkably little about daily practice, because awareness without any real mechanism for verification or enforcement leaves people in an oddly powerless position, able to suspect but never quite able to confirm, and certainly never quite able to opt out of a food system they had no real alternative to relying on. It would take something more than a chemist's careful book, however, well researched, to finally force this quiet, uneasy status quo to change. It would take in the end something the public could not simply read about, and set aside something that would happen not in the careful language of a scientific treatise, but in an ordinary town on an ordinary afternoon, involving people who had done nothing more than trust the very system everyone around them had by then learned to live with, uneasily and largely in silence. Every long history like this one carries a hinge, a single moment where all the quiet warnings, all the small human compromises finally meet the world in a way that can no longer be waved away or explained around. For the story we have been building tonight, that moment arrives on an ordinary Saturday in late October in the market town of Bradford in the north of England in the year 1858. I want to walk into this carefully the way I would want someone to walk into it for me, because what happened that day was genuinely painful, and it deserves to be told with the weight it carries, not with any impulse to make it feel more dramatic than it already was. Bradford at this time is a busy growing town, its economy built largely on wool and textiles, its streets filled on market days with the ordinary rhythm of buying and selling that we have already spent so much of tonight sitting inside. Among the many small traders working the town square is a man known to almost everyone by a nickname rather than his given name. A common thing for tradesmen who had spent years in the same spot calling out to the same passing families. He sells sweets from a simple stall, and among his most popular items is a hard round mint humbug, cheap enough for a working family to buy for their children as a small Saturday treat. The recipe for these sweets, like many cheap candies of this era, does not use pure sugar throughout. Sugar is genuinely expensive, and confectioners across England had for some time taken to stretching their sugar with a cheaper substitute, a step so common in the trade by this point that it barely registered as deception at all. More a simple accepted cost-saving practice everyone in the industry quietly understood. On this particular occasion, the confectioner supplying the sweet sends someone to purchase the usual quantity of this cheap filler from a local supplier. What that person receives instead, through a mistake that would take considerable investigation afterward to fully untangle, is not the harmless white powder the trade normally used, but a substance that looks remarkably similar to the eye stored in similarly unmarked containers drawn from the same general shelf. It is a poison, a highly toxic compound containing arsenic, the kind of substance kept under normal circumstances for entirely different and far more dangerous purposes. Nobody along this chain, not the assistant who filled the order, not the confectioner who received it, not the street seller who purchased his stock that week, has any reason to suspect anything is wrong. The substance looks the part, it measures the part. It is folded into the sugar mixture the way the cheaper filler always was, boiled down shaped, and set out to cool into the same familiar rounded mints that have been sold from this stall for years without a single problem. There is no unusual smell. There is no visible difference in the finished candy. Everything about this batch, to every eye that examines it before it reaches the public, looks exactly like every other batch that came before it. The sweets go out to several sellers around the town that Saturday, including the familiar stall in the market square. Families do what families in this story have done again and again tonight across so many decades and so many different foods. They buy what has always been safe before. Children receive small paper twists of humbugs as a treat, the kind of small joy that costs very little and means quite a lot on an ordinary weekend afternoon. It does not take long for something to feel wrong. Within hours, people who had eaten the sweets began falling seriously ill, and word spread through the town with the particular frightening speed that illness spreads when nobody yet understands its cause. Physicians in Bradford, faced with a sudden wave of patients presenting the same alarming symptoms, worked quickly to understand what they were dealing with, and it did not take especially long for suspicion to fall on the sweets themselves, given how many of the sick had, it turned out, purchased from the very same stall that same day. The scale of what unfolded over the following days is difficult to sit with, and I want to tell it to you honestly, rather than softening the true weight of it while still keeping the telling itself calm the way this story deserves. In total, roughly 20 people lost their lives in the days following that Saturday, and a further 200 or so were made seriously ill, a number that varies slightly depending on which historical account you consult. Since record-keeping in a crisis of this kind unfolding quickly across a town without any established system for tracking mass poisoning was understandably imperfect, many of those affected were heartbreakingly children drawn to the stall precisely because a humbug was an affordable ordinary pleasure, the kind of small treat that should never have carried any danger at all. I do not want to linger too long on the physical details of what these families experienced, because that is not the purpose of telling this story, and it would only add distress without adding understanding. What matters for our purposes tonight is the shape of the tragedy itself, and what it reveals about everything we have been sitting with across this entire evening. This was not caused by cruelty. Nobody along that chain of hands wanted this outcome or had any reason to expect it. It was caused by exactly the kind of quiet accumulated vulnerability we have been tracing since the very beginning of tonight's story. A system built on cheap substitution, on trust extended without verification, on containers that looked alike sitting close enough together, on a shelf that a single human mistake could travel unnoticed all the way from a supplier's storeroom into a child's mouth on a Saturday afternoon. News of what had happened in Bradford did not stay contained to the town itself. It spread outward through newspapers, through the kind of shocked urgent conversation that moves quickly between towns connected by rail and post. And for the first time in this entire history, we have been tracing tonight the danger of adulterated food stopped being an abstract concern discussed mainly by chemists and the occasional worried reader of a dense scientific book. It became something the wider public could see plainly, A tragedy with names attached with grieving families with the cause that investigators would soon be able to explain in exact, verifiable detail. It's worth pausing here on something that tends to surprise people when they first learn this part of the story. Despite how severe the consequences were the underlying practice that made this tragedy possible, the routine stretching of sugar with a cheap filler was not at the time considered a shocking or unusual thing to discover. It was in a strange and uncomfortable way simply how a significant portion of the confectionery trade already operated. What made this particular case so devastating was not that a rule had been broken in some rare unthinkable way. It was that an already accepted, already normalized shortcut had collided through simple human error with a substance so much more dangerous than anyone along that chain had ever imagined they were handling. Historians who study this period generally treat the poisoning as a tragic accident rather than a deliberate act, since the evidence collected afterward pointed clearly toward a mistaken substitution rather than any intent to harm. Though some accounts differ slightly on exactly how the mix-up occurred, since the surviving records from the investigation are not perfectly consistent on every small detail of that particular week. There is something almost unbearably human at the centre of this, isn't there? The idea that a tragedy of this scale did not require anyone to be a villain at all. It required only a chain of ordinary shortcuts, ordinary trust, and one small catastrophic mistake arriving at exactly the wrong moment in exactly the wrong shipment to reach exactly the people least able to protect themselves from it. For the town of Bradford, the days following that Saturday were understandably filled with grief, with fear, and with an urgent unanswered question hanging over every household that had until that week felt no particular reason to worry about something as ordinary as a bag of sweets. And for the wider public reading about it in newspapers across the country, the tragedy did something that Accum's careful, methodical book, for all its honesty, had never quite managed to do on its own. It made the danger impossible to look away from and impossible this time to quietly set aside. What remained now was the difficult, careful work of understanding exactly what had gone wrong, tracing the mistake back through every hand it had passed through, and beginning to ask publicly and insistently a question that had been quietly circling beneath the surface of English life for decades. If something as simple and beloved as a childhood sweet could carry this much hidden danger, what if anything could be trusted at all, and who, if anyone, was going to be responsible for making sure it never happened again? In the days after the sweets left their stall, Bradford needed answers, and the task of finding them fell to a small number of local men whose training had until that week likely never prepared them for anything on this scale. Understanding what actually happened in those following days tells us something important. Not just about this particular tragedy, but about the state of scientific investigation itself in the middle of the 1800s, a period when the tools of forensic chemistry were still relatively young, and when a case like this one would end up pushing those tools and the men using them further than they had often been pushed before. The first and most urgent task was establishing beyond any reasonable doubt exactly what substance had caused so many people to fall ill so quickly. This may sound like a simple question, but in 1858, chemical analysis capable of detecting a specific poison within a food sample required real expertise, precise laboratory technique, and access to methods that had only been refined and made reasonably reliable in recent decades. Fortunately for the town, and for the families desperate to understand what had happened to them, a local analytical chemist was called upon to examine the remaining sweets, and what he found confirmed the growing suspicion that had already begun to spread through Bradford in whispered, frightened conversation. The confectionery did indeed contain arsenic present in a concentration far beyond anything that could have entered the sweets by accident of nature. This was not some trace contamination from soil or water. This was a substantial, unmistakable presence, consistent with exactly the kind of substitution error that investigators were already beginning to suspect. The method used to confirm the presence of arsenic in this era deserves a moment of its own because it represents one of the genuinely remarkable, if undertold, threads running through the history of food safety. By the 1858, chemists across Europe had access to a relatively new and highly sensitive test capable of detecting even small amounts of arsenic in biological or food samples, a technique developed a few decades earlier by a chemist working to solve exactly this kind of problem, poisoning cases where the substance involved needed to be proven with scientific certainty rather than mere suspicion. The test worked by combining a suspected sample with specific chemical reagents in a way that produced a visible, unmistakable deposit. If arsenic was present, a deposit trained eyes could examine and confirm with real confidence. Before tests of this precision existed, poisoning cases, whether accidental or deliberate, often rested on circumstantial evidence alone, on symptoms and timing and coincidence, without any way to point to a specific verifiable substance as the true cause. The existence of a reliable test by the time Bradford needed one meant that for perhaps the first time in a case of this scale, the people investigating a mass poisoning could offer something closer to certainty rather than educated guesswork. Once the presence of the arsenic had been confirmed, investigators turned to the harder, more painstaking work of tracing exactly how it had entered the sweets in the first place, following the supply chain backward through every hand the ingredients had passed through that week. This part of the investigation reveals something quietly remarkable about how ordinary, how almost mundane the actual point of failure turned out to be. The confectioner who made the sweets had, as was completely standard practice in the trade at that time, sent an assistant to purchase a quantity of a cheap filler substance from a local supplier intended to stretch the sugar in the recipe, the way countless other confectioners across England were doing without incident week after week. The supplier who filled that order, it emerged during questioning, was dealing with a supply of the usual filler that had, for reasons investigators worked hard to reconstruct, run short that particular week. Rather than turn the order away, a substitute container was reached for one that, through a combination of poor labeling, dim lighting, and the simple visual similarity between the two substances, was mistaken for the correct filler. I want to sit with this detail for a moment because it carries real weight for everything we have talked about tonight. The substance mistakenly measured out that day was kept in the same general storage area as ordinary trade goods, not isolated with the kind of clear, deliberate caution that we would expect today for anything so dangerous. There was at this point in history no comprehensive legal requirement mandating that poisonous substances be stored separately from food ingredients, no standardized labeling system that made a dangerous compound instantly unmistakably distinguishable from a harmless one at a glance. The tragedy in Bradford did not happen because someone deliberately reached for poison. It happened in large part because the systems that should have made such a mistake nearly impossible simply did not yet exist. This is worth returning to gently because it reshapes how we understand blame in this story. The formal inquest that followed, convened to determine legal responsibility for what had happened, worked carefully through testimony from the confectioner, the supplier, and the assistant who had made the fatal purchase, along with the chemist whose analysis had confirmed the presence of arsenic. What emerges from the surviving records of this inquest is a picture considerably more complicated than a simple story of a single guilty party. Responsibility, as the investigators themselves seemed to recognize, was genuinely diffuse, spread across a chain of ordinary trade practices that had until this particular week functioned without any obvious catastrophe forcing anyone to examine them closely. Scholars who study this case today continue to debate the precise degree of individual culpability that should be assigned within that chain, since the surviving inquest records, while detailed, do not fully resolve every question about who bore the greater responsibility, the supplier who reached for the wrong container, or the wider trade custom that had normalized the use of cheap, loosely regulated fillers in the first place. What the evidence does establish clearly, and what the inquest itself concluded, is that this was understood as a tragic accident arising from negligence rather than any deliberate intention to cause harm, a conclusion that shaped both the legal consequences that followed for those directly involved and, more significantly, the wider public reaction to the case. Because the public reaction once the details of the investigation became widely known through newspaper coverage across the country was not simply grief for Bradford alone. It was something closer to a dawning, uncomfortable recognition, spreading through households far beyond the town itself, that the very same conditions which had allowed this particular mistake to happen, poorly labelled containers, unregulated substitutes, an entire trade built on quite informal shortcuts, existed just as readily in countless other towns and countless other shops selling countless other everyday goods that ordinary families purchased without a second thought. If it could happen with a simple bag of sweets in Bradford, people began to ask in kitchens and parlours and newspaper columns across the country, what else quietly might already be sitting on a shelf somewhere waiting for its own small catastrophic mistake? There is something almost tender in how this shift in public understanding unfolded even as it emerged from something so painful. For decades, the danger of adulterated food had remained something largely discussed among specialists, chemists like Ackham decades earlier, or the occasional local official quietly aware of a problem too large and too diffuse for any single town to solve alone. Bradford changed that not through any single new piece of scientific knowledge, since much of what the investigation confirmed had in a general sense already been suspected by anyone paying close attention. What Bradford changed was scale of feeling the sudden, undeniable proof carried in newspaper columns into homes across the country that this was not an abstract concern belonging to laboratories and dense chemical treatises, but something that had already reached directly into ordinary families, taking the lives of children who had done nothing more than accept a Saturday treat from a trusted familiar stall. It is worth noting gently how the investigation itself, for all its careful and genuinely impressive scientific work, could not undo what had already happened. Chemistry could confirm the cause. It could trace the chain of error back to its origin with real precision. But it could not restore what those families had lost, and the surviving accounts from Bradford in the weeks that followed describe a town moving through its ordinary rhythms with a new, quiet heaviness underneath them. Market days continuing because they had to, but carrying now the memory of exactly how fragile the trust between seller and buyer had turned out to be. What the investigation could do and what it ultimately achieved in ways that would ripple outward far beyond Bradford itself was established with a level of scientific and legal clarity that had rarely existed before in a case of this kind, an unambiguous, well-documented account of precisely how ordinary trade practices left unregulated and unexamined could produce consequences of this magnitude. That documented clarity would prove to matter enormously in the months and years that followed, as the conversation in Bradford began slowly to travel outward into rooms far removed from the town itself, rooms where questions about responsibility and about what should be done to prevent anything like this from happening again were only just beginning to be asked in earnest. The story of Bradford did not stay Bradford's alone for very long. And one of the more striking discoveries in tracing this history is how many different rooms began almost simultaneously to claim a piece of its meaning, each one telling the tragedy slightly differently, depending on what that particular room already believed or already wanted to believe about who was truly responsible. To understand why the public reaction took the shape it did, it helps to step back a little further than Bradford itself. Because Bradford did not actually introduce the idea of food adulteration into public conversation, it confirmed something that had in fact already been documented carefully and with considerable scientific rigour nearly a decade earlier by a man whose work deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. In the early 1850s, a physician and microscopist named Arthur Hill had begun a systematic investigation into the food sold across London, using a microscope to examine samples of bread, tea, coffee, sugar, and dozens of other everyday goods, publishing his findings in a respected medical journal in a series that ran for several years. What Hassall found, laid out methodically and illustrated with detailed drawings of what he observed under magnification, was adulteration on a scale that startled even readers who had already absorbed Occam's earlier warnings decades before. He documented ground rice and potato starch mixed into arrowroot, chicory, and roasted grain stretched into coffee and dye, added to sweets using compounds that examined closely revealed themselves to contain genuine toxic risk. What makes Hassall's work particularly remarkable, and part of why it deserves a place in tonight's story, is the method itself. Unlike Occam's earlier chemical approach, Hassall relied heavily on the microscope, a tool that allowed him to see quite literally the physical particles of foreign substances mixed into food in a way that felt more immediately convincing to the ordinary reader than a chemical reaction described in technical language. A drawing of ground bone fragments, visible under magnification, sitting alongside a sample of flour, carried a kind of plain visual authority that was difficult to argue with. And crucially, Hassall did something that pushed his findings further into public consciousness than Occam had ever quite managed. He began in later installments of his published work naming specific tradesmen and shops found to be selling adulterated goods, a genuinely bold and legally risky decision that exposed him to the threat of lawsuits and did in fact result in at least one legal challenge brought against him by an aggrieved seller. Historians studying this period note that Hassall's willingness to name names, rather than simply describing adulteration in the abstract, is likely part of why his findings achieved more lasting public traction than Occam's had, though the full extent of Hassall's direct influence on the specific legislative changes that followed remains something scholars continue to weigh rather than settle definitively. So when Bradford happened in 1858, it did not land in a public conversation starting from nothing. It landed in a conversation that had already quietly been building for the better part of a decade, thanks largely to Hassall's patient methodical work that had informed the founding a few years earlier of an official analytical body attached to that same medical journal, tasked specifically with continuing this kind of investigation into the food supply on an ongoing basis. Bradford, in a sense, did not introduce a new fear. It confirmed in the most painful and undeniable way possible a fear that careful scientists had already been trying for years to get the wider public and its lawmakers to take seriously. And yet even with this foundation already laid, the accounts that emerged in the aftermath of Bradford diverged in ways worth sitting with tonight, because they reveal something true about how societies process a tragedy of this kind. In the newspapers and public commentary that follow, several distinct narratives competed for dominance, and none of them was entirely wrong, even as each one told only part of the fuller picture. One account common among reformers and the growing body of scientific voices who had been raising this alarm for years framed Bradford as the inevitable tragic result of a system that had been allowed to operate for far too long without any meaningful oversight. A systemic failure rather than an isolated accident, and one that demanded immediate legislative response. A second, somewhat different account, more common in certain trade and business circles, framed the tragedy specifically as an isolated freak accident, a mistake tragic but rare that should not be used to justify sweeping new regulation over an entire industry built in the vast majority of its daily practice on far less dangerous, if still ethically questionable, substitutions. There is a certain understandable human logic to this second account, even if history would ultimately side more with the first. Most adulteration, after all, involved chalk water and cheap fillers rather than arsenic substances that degraded quality without posing anything close to the same lethal risk. And it is not entirely unreasonable that some tradesmen and some segments of the public resisted having their entire livelihood recast overnight as inherently dangerous because of one catastrophic unrepresentative error. A third account, quieter but genuinely present in some of the writing from this period, turned its attention less toward tradesmen and more toward the wider economic pressures shaping the entire marketplace, arguing that adulteration flourished not primarily because individual sellers were dishonest, but because competitive pressure and consumers themselves demanding the lowest possible prices had created conditions where cutting corners had become in effect almost economically necessary for a seller hoping to survive against undercutting rivals. This account carried an uncomfortable implication that some readers at the time resisted the suggestion that the public itself, through its own preference for cheapness over verified quality, bore some quiet portion of responsibility for the system that had made Bradford possible in the first place. Is it entirely fair to place that weight on ordinary families simply trying to stretch a modest household budget as far as it could go? Historians examining this debate today generally treat it as genuinely unresolved, noting that economic pressure, weak regulation, and individual dishonesty were almost certainly intertwined in ways that no single account fully captures, and that assigning primary blame to any one factor tends to say as much about the values of whoever is doing the assigning as it does about the historical reality itself. What is striking looking back across all of these competing accounts together is how much they still agree on beneath their disagreements. Every version of this story, whichever emphasis it favoured, arrived at roughly the same practical conclusion that the existing patchwork of informal trust, local reputation, and occasional scientific investigation was no longer sufficient for a country whose food supply had grown this large, this complex, and this thoroughly disconnected from the people ultimately consuming it. Even those most reluctant to blame tradesmen broadly could not easily argue that the current arrangement, one in which a mistaken substitution could travel from a poorly labelled container to a child's mouth without a single mandatory checkpoint along the way, was working as it should. This growing, if imperfectly unified consensus mattered enormously because a tragedy alone rarely changes a system on its own. What changes a system is the slow, difficult work of turning shared alarm into something more durable, something written into law, rather than simply into newspaper columns and public sentiment that would inevitably begin to fade as the immediate shock of Bradford receded into memory. That work had already quietly begun, in fact, in certain rooms far removed from Bradford's Market Square rooms, where officials and reformers, some of them, long familiar with Hassel's earlier findings, were beginning to ask a question that would occupy the coming years in earnest. Not simply how to prevent another Bradford specifically, but how to build something sturdier than trust itself, something that did not depend on the accident of a careful chemist happening to look closely enough, or a tragedy happening to be severe enough to finally force the public's attention. The years immediately following, Bradford moved slower than grief usually wants change to move, and that slowness itself tells us something worth sitting with tonight. Something about how difficult it actually is to turn a shared painful feeling into something as concrete and lasting as law. In the immediate aftermath, there was no single dramatic moment where Parliament rose as one and declared the problem solved. What happened instead was quieter, more incremental, shaped by years of accumulated pressure from multiple directions finally converging at once. Reformers who had been citing Hassel's earlier findings for the better part of a decade now had something newspapers across the country could not easily dismiss as abstract or theoretical: a specific town, specific names, a specific number of grieving families who could, if asked, describe exactly what an ordinary Saturday afternoon had cost them. That combination, careful scientific documentation paired with an undeniable, deeply human tragedy, proved to be a different kind of pressure than either element had managed to create alone, even. So the path toward meaningful legislation was neither straight nor especially fast, and it is worth understanding why. Because the reason reveals something true about how change tends to happen in any era, not just this one. Many members of Parliament in this period held genuine, sincere reservations about government intervention into private trade. A philosophical position rooted in a broader 19th century belief that markets generally corrected themselves and that heavy-handed regulation risked doing more economic harm than the problem it aimed to solve. This was not for most of these lawmakers a callous dismissal of what had happened in Bradford. It reflected a genuinely different understanding of where the proper boundary between government and commerce should sit, an understanding that a growing body of evidence, tragedy after tragedy, would only slowly begin to shift. An earlier attempt at addressing food adulteration had in fact already reached the statute books a few years before Bradford, in 1860. A piece of legislation that, looking back now, reveals just how tentative and cautiously worded early food safety law actually was. This first act gave local authorities the power to appoint analysts and take action against sellers of adulterated food, but the language of the law left considerable room for interpretation, and enforcement was left almost entirely to the discretion of individual local authorities, many of whom had neither the funding nor frankly the appetite to pursue prosecutions against tradesmen within their own communities, people they very likely knew personally, people whose businesses supported families much like their own. It is a detail that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. That meaningful food safety legislation in England actually predates Bradford by a couple of years, and yet Bradford still happened precisely because a law that exists without genuine enforcement mechanisms behind it functions in practice closer to a suggestion than a real safeguard. This is, I think, one of the more sobering lessons buried inside this particular chapter of the story. Bradford did not happen because nobody had thought to write a law. It happened in part because the law that already existed had not yet been given the teeth, the funding or the consistent enforcement needed to actually change behaviour on the ground in ordinary shops on ordinary market days. Scholars examining the effectiveness of this earlier 1860 legislation generally agree that its practical impact in the years immediately following its passage was quite limited, though. The surviving records of prosecutions from this period are patchy enough across different regions that no single comprehensive picture of exactly how limited its effect truly was has ever been fully assembled. What Bradford did accomplish in the years that followed was harden political will in a way that pure documentation, however careful and thorough, had not quite managed to do on its own. The tragedy became a reference point cited again and again in parliamentary debate and public commentary throughout the 1860s, a concrete answer to anyone still inclined to argue that adulteration was a minor overstated problem unworthy of serious government attention. It became increasingly difficult in the years after Bradford for anyone to make that argument in good faith without confronting the memory of exactly what had happened to that town's children. Alongside this shifting political mood, something else was happening as well, something less visible in the newspaper headlines of the time, but arguably just as important to the fuller story. The scientific profession itself was maturing, developing more standardized methods, more consistent training, and a growing body of professionals who saw food and drug analysis not as an occasional curiosity, but as a legitimate ongoing area of specialized work. The official analytical body that had grown out of Husserl's earlier efforts continued its investigations throughout this period, building an increasingly detailed, increasingly credible record of exactly how widespread adulteration remained, even years after Bradford had briefly focused the country's attention on the problem. This steady, patient accumulation of evidence mattered enormously because it meant that when lawmakers eventually returned to strengthen the earlier weaker legislation, they were not working from vague public sentiment alone. They had years of careful, methodical documentation to draw on case after case, sample after sample, building a picture too consistent and too well substantiated to be easily dismissed. It would take until the middle of the 1870s, roughly a full generation after Occam's original warnings, and nearly 2 decades after Bradford itself, before England passed legislation with meaningfully stronger enforcement provisions requiring local authorities to appoint qualified public analysts and giving those analysts real consistent authority to test food and pursue prosecution against sellers found to be adulterating their goods. Even this later law was not perfect, and historians studying its early implementation note that enforcement still varied considerably from region to region, depending heavily on the resources and priorities of individual local authorities. But it represented something genuinely different from what had come before, a shift from occasional dependent on circumstance oversight towards something closer to a systematic, professionalized approach to food safety, one built to function whether or not another tragedy happened to capture the public's attention that particular year. There is something worth pausing on here, something almost quietly moving if you sit with it long enough. None of this happened quickly. None of it happened because a single dramatic event forced an immediate sweeping transformation the way these stories are sometimes told when compressed into a shorter telling. It happened slowly, unevenly built from decades of patient scientific documentation, one painful tragedy that finally made the danger impossible to ignore, and years of difficult, often frustrating political negotiation that followed. Real change, it turns out, rarely arrives as a single dramatic turning point. More often it arrives the way a shoreline changes through the accumulated weight of many smaller forces, each one seemingly modest on its own, pressing steadily in the same direction. Until one day, looking back, the landscape has genuinely shifted. And shift it did in ways that would extend far beyond England's own borders, far beyond the particular decades we have been sitting inside tonight. Because what had been learned here painfully and slowly about chemistry, about enforcement, about the specific gap between writing a law and actually making it function in ordinary shops on ordinary market days, would not stay confined to one country for very much longer. Other nations watching this long, difficult process unfold would soon find themselves confronting remarkably similar questions of their own. Questions about trust, about distance, about what it actually takes to make sure a family sitting down to an ordinary meal can do so without quietly wondering what exactly they are about to eat. What happened in England did not stay in England, and tracing where this story travels next reveals something almost startling about how universal this particular struggle turned out to be, playing out with striking similarity across oceans and decades, as though different nations were independently arriving at the same painful lessons on their own separate timelines. Across the Atlantic in the United States, a strikingly similar pattern was unfolding through the second half of the 1800s. Though it would take even longer there to translate public alarm into meaningful federal law. American cities, growing just as rapidly as their English counterparts, developed remarkably similar problems with milk, stretched by water, coffee bulked with roasted grain, and preservatives added to meat and other perishables using chemical compounds whose long-term health effects were at the time poorly understood even by the chemists using them. One chemist working within the federal government, a man who would later become known as something of a crusader, on this exact issue began in the 1880s to systematically test common American foods and additives, eventually organizing the series of experiments that have become genuinely famous within the history of food science, in which groups of healthy young government employees volunteered to eat meals deliberately dosed with common food preservatives of the era, so that researchers could observe and document the resulting effects on human health under controlled, monitored conditions. These volunteers became known somewhat affectionately by a nickname referencing the poison squad they had essentially formed and their willingness to subject themselves to genuine risk in service of public knowledge represents one of the more remarkable, if still not widely known, chapters in the story of how food safety science actually developed. It would take a particular kind of tragedy again, though this time delivered through the pages of a novel rather than a courtroom inquest, to finally push American federal legislation over the threshold that had eluded it for so long. In 1906, a writer published a novel intended primarily as an exposure of harsh labor conditions within the American meatpacking industry, hoping to draw public sympathy toward the exploited workers whose lives filled its pages. What actually captured the public imagination to the author's own later, somewhat rueful acknowledgement was not primarily the human suffering he'd set out to document, but the vivid stomach-turning descriptions of unsanitary conditions inside the meatpacking plants themselves, details about contaminated meat, spoiled product disguised and resold in processing environments far removed from anything a consumer would have imagined lay behind the products on their own dinner table. Public outcry following the novel's publication was swift and considerable, reaching all the way to the White House itself, where the sitting president, reportedly troubled enough by what he had read to order his own independent investigation into the conditions the novel described, found himself facing mounting political pressure to act. Within the same year, federal legislation finally passed, establishing meaningful oversight over food and pharmaceutical safety at a national level. For the first time in American history, a milestone reached much like England's own experience decades earlier, only after patient scientific documentation had been forced into undeniable public consciousness by something far more visceral and immediate than a laboratory report alone could achieve. There is a pattern worth sitting with here, one that repeats itself with almost eerie consistency across different countries, different decades, different specific tragedies. Careful documentation alone, however rigorous, however honest, rarely proves sufficient on its own to move a government toward real regulatory action. It typically takes something else alongside it, a story, a scandal, a tragedy, vivid and human enough to travel beyond specialist circles into ordinary households, before the political will required for genuine change finally reliably arrives. Historians who study the broader history of regulatory reform across multiple countries have noted this recurring pattern. Though they continue to debate exactly why documented evidence alone so consistently fails to be enough, some pointing toward the simple psychological reality that statistics rarely move people the way a specific named tragedy does, others pointing toward the deeper political reality that meaningful regulation nearly always threatens some existing economic interest, powerful enough to resist until public pressure becomes genuinely impossible to ignore. What emerged from these parallel struggles across England and the United States, and in time countries across continental Europe as similar patterns unfolded there as well, was something considerably larger than any single piece of legislation. It was the slow, hard-won birth of an entirely new relationship between governments and the food their citizens consumed, one built on the radical, at the time still somewhat controversial idea that a government bore genuine responsibility for verifying rather than simply hoping that food sold to its citizens was safe. This idea, which can feel almost self-evident to us now, tucked warmly into the world you are living in tonight, represented a genuine philosophical shift from centuries of assumption that food safety was fundamentally a private matter, a question of individual trust between buyer and seller, with government's proper role limited mainly to punishing especially severe or deliberate fraud after the fact rather than preventing it beforehand through systematic oversight. The institutions born from this shift, agencies tasked specifically with food and drug regulation, trained inspectors, visiting processing facilities, standardized testing laboratories, mandatory labeling requirements slowly expanding over subsequent decades, did not appear all at once fully formed. They grew gradually generation by generation, each new law typically arriving in response to some fresh scandal or tragedy, that revealed a gap the previous legislation had failed to close. A pattern that, if you look closely, continues in various forms even into the world you know today, each new food safety concern still tending to prompt regulatory attention only after public alarm reaches a certain threshold rather than through purely preventive foresight alone. And yet, for all the slowness, for all the tragedy required to force each incremental step forward, something genuinely remarkable had, by the early decades of the 1900s, begun to take shape across much of the industrialized world. A family sitting down to a meal in a city like London or New York or countless other growing urban centres could, for the first time in the long history we have been tracing tonight, reasonably expect that the food in front of them had passed through at least some layer of verification beyond the seller's own word. It was not perfect, it would never be entirely perfect, but it represented a genuine hard-won departure from every single century that had come before it. A departure built not on any single dramatic breakthrough, but on the accumulated weight of chemists who tested what others preferred not to examine too closely, journalists and novelists who made abstract danger feel immediate and human, and countless ordinary families across 2 continents who paid in ways ranging from mild inconvenience to devastating loss for lessons that would eventually be written into law. What remains now, as this long patient story approaches its final turn tonight, is to understand how far this idea has travelled since those early uncertain decades, and what it actually looks like, this quiet inheritance built from so much difficulty, when you sit down tonight or any night to something as ordinary and as effortlessly trusted as a simple meal. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a story once all of its pieces are finally laid out beside one another, and I think we have reached that quiet now, you and I sitting here together, at the far end of a journey that began with something as small and as ordinary as a mint humbug on a market stall. Think back for a moment to where we started tonight. A woman we never named in a wild place we could never quite locate on any map, tasting a plant for the very first time because someone always has to be first. A family in ancient Rome sweetening their wine with something they had no way of knowing was slowly working against them across years, across generations, hidden inside the very luxury they were proudest of. A mother in a growing city pouring milk for her child each morning, trusting a colour and a texture that had been deliberately, quietly arranged to earn that trust whether or not it had been earned honestly. A chemist largely forgotten now who tried to tell an entire city an uncomfortable truth and watched his own reputation become the price of having spoken first. And a town on an ordinary Saturday where an entire chain of small human forgivable shortcuts finally met a single unforgivable mistake, and nothing about that day could ever be undone. What strikes me most, turning all of this over one final time tonight, is how rarely any of it required someone to be truly wicked. Danger across nearly the whole of this long history arrived instead through something far more familiar, far closer to home. Ordinary pressure, ordinary shortcuts, ordinary trust extended because there was in practice no real alternative. That is, I think, one of the harder truths this story asks us to sit with. It would almost be easier, wouldn't it, if history handed us a villain to blame and be finished with. Instead, it hands us something more honest and more difficult. It hands us people largely ordinary doing what people under pressure have always done, cutting corners. They told themselves were survivable trusting systems they had no real power to verify, hoping the way every generation before them had hoped that today would be a day like all the others. And yet alongside that difficult honesty there is something else worth carrying with you tonight, something quieter and considerably warmer. Because for every mother deceived by chalk hidden in milk, there was also eventually a chemist willing to spend years peering through a microscope at food nobody else wanted to look at too closely. For every town left to bury its children, there was also eventually a parliament, however slowly, however reluctantly, finally willing to write new protections into law. Progress in this story never arrived in one clean dramatic gesture. It arrived slowly, unevenly built by people who kept looking, kept documenting, kept insisting on a better standard than the one they had inherited, even when the world around them seemed content to leave things exactly as they were. There is a particular piece of evidence that has stayed with me more than almost anything else in this whole story, and I want to leave it with you before we close tonight. In archives connected to that long inquest in Bradford, among the testimony and the careful chemical findings, there survives a simple detail from the investigation, a note about the ordinary shelf where the fatal substance had been mistakenly stored, sitting close enough to harmless trade goods that a tired hand, reaching quickly on a busy morning, could not easily tell the difference. It is such a small, unremarkable detail on its own, and yet it holds inside it the entire weight of everything we have spent this evening exploring. Not a monster, not a conspiracy, just a shelf arranged the way, countless shelves like it had always been arranged, until an entire town learned at devastating cost why it needed to be arranged differently. That shelf in its own quiet way is where the modern world we live in tonight actually begins, not in some grand declaration, in a small overlooked failure examined closely enough and taken seriously enough that it finally changed something. So let the pace slow now the way it always does near the end of a long evening like this one. Think of how far this particular thread has travelled, from a nameless forager testing a plant no one had tested before, to a modern kitchen calm and certain when nothing on the shelf needs to be questioned at all. That distance took centuries to cross. It was paid for by people whose names we will never know, by children in Bradford whose only mistake was trusting a Saturday treat, by a chemist who lost his standing for telling the truth too early, by countless ordinary families in countless ordinary kitchens who simply hoped and were sometimes wrong to. None of that weight has disappeared. It is simply no longer visible. It sits quietly beneath the surface of every safe, unremarkable meal you have ever eaten without a second thought. This is in the end what history so often is, not a single dramatic turning point, a long, slow accumulation of ordinary people paying attention when it would have been so much easier not to. The past does not ask you to carry its grief tonight, only perhaps to notice. Somewhere right now in a kitchen you will never see a shelf is arranged carefully, a label is checked without thinking twice. A meal is served and eaten and forgotten by morning exactly the way an ordinary meal should be. That quiet, that ease, that unremarkable safety. It was not always here. Someone built it slowly out of loss. And tonight, wherever you are resting inside it. Let that be enough.